record. Okay, welcome to the Scrum. I'm James Carden. Today, we're launching a series of Q&As with leading international relations experts, thinkers, and practitioners. And I'm pleased to welcome our very first guest, Ambassador John Evans. John has had a distinguished career, first as a diplomat and later as one of our wisest analysts on Europe and Eurasia. John began his career in the U.S. Foreign Service in the early 70s, serving in posts as far afield as Tehran, Prague, and Moscow. In the final years of the Cold War, John served at the U.S. mission to NATO and as deputy director of the Soviet desk. In the 90s, John returned to Prague, and then it was back to Russia, where he served as consul general at St. Petersburg from 1994 to 1997. And it was during those years, John happened to come across a young up-and-coming Russian intelligence agent turned Politico who would go on to gain some notoriety in the coming years. And more on that a bit later. John would go on to direct the State Department's Office of Russian Affairs. And later in 2004, he became ambassador to Armenia. John has also written what is, in my opinion, the single most illuminating article of the past decade on Russian President Vladimir Putin. This appeared in the National Interest in September of 2019, and we're going to link to that in the interview notes. So John, thanks so much for coming on. I'd like to begin with Armenia. You coordinated the U.S. government response to the Armenian earthquake in 1988, which by some estimates left between 25 and 50,000 people dead, and it left hundreds of thousands of people homeless. And later you served as ambassador there. Today, Armenia is back in the news. Last September, fighting broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. A ceasefire was negotiated by Russia, which has since deployed peacekeepers there. But by many accounts, the peace is exceedingly fragile. So my general understanding is that Nagorno-Karabakh is an Armenian majoritarian enclave that was part of the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. But its efforts to unify with Armenia have been frustrated since the 1980s. So the conflict isn't new. Can you take us through some of the relevant history and explain the proximate cause of this most recent round of fighting?
Sure, James. It's very good to see you. I hope everything's well. Before we start, I just want to say how sorry I was that Steve Cohen, with whom I know you work closely, passed away in September. And I felt that very much too, because although I never studied with Professor Cohen, I discovered him through his book on Bukharin. And it opened my eyes to the fact that politics in that part of the world, which we more or less decided was just a totalitarian massif, frozen with nothing going on, that wasn't really true. There's always been politics under the surface, and that's certainly true, even more so today. And we as Americans aren't necessarily the best ones to figure out what is going on over there. And of course, coming to the situation in the South Caucasus, this war that broke out, as you said, September 27th, was hardly reported in the Western mainstream media. There were a couple of reports here and there, but it happened at a time, and I think this was intentional on the part of the government in Baku. It happened at a time when the United States was totally consumed with its presidential election, not to mention the fly on Vice President Pence's head at one point. But also the COVID pandemic was affecting everybody, including the participants in the war. And Russia, for its part, was very much preoccupied with the demonstrations in Belarus right next door. So the timing for the war seemed to have been calculated almost perfectly to come in under the radar. And there was very little reporting, particularly in the American press. The French press was more attentive to it, being closer in many respects. And about a week after the war started, the Los Angeles Times did dispatch a pair of reporters to the war zone. So we started getting information, but it was very spotty. Both sides, I have to say, lied about what was going on, or at least prevaricated, did not give the true facts of what was happening. The Armenians had won their war against Azerbaijan back in the early 90s, and it ended in a ceasefire at that time. Not a full peace agreement, but shall we say, a shaky ceasefire, but that had held for some 26 years while the international community, in the form of the so-called Minsk group co-chairs, France, Russia, and the United States, tried to mediate a peaceful settlement between the government in Baku and the what they would call the secessionist forces in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was in the Soviet system an autonomous region having certain powers of its own. But as the Soviet Union collapsed in those years, early 90s, there were a number of these conflicts that broke out on the territory of the former Soviet Union. And they usually had to do with some unresolved ethnic and economic questions. It wasn't the fault of anyone in particular. It was just, these were sort of time bombs that were lodged in the Soviet system. And when the system lost its authority, in particular, the Communist Party lost its authority, these conflicts came back to the surface. And the first one to come back with a vengeance was this unresolved question about the approximately 150,000 Armenians who were stranded in an autonomous region completely encircled by Azerbaijan. This was the product of the Commissariat of Nationalities, which Joseph Stalin chaired back in the early 20s. And the Armenians had always resented the fact that they had to be put under the authority of the Azerbaijan regime. So this all came back with a vengeance. For 26 years of diplomacy, there wasn't much to show. The mediators tried their best to get the two sides to come to some agreement on the status of Karabakh and everything else that needed to be done. But the parties were very stubborn, and they came very close several times, including once in Palm Beach, or rather in Key West, when the Americans brought the two presidents over, and they came very close to reaching an agreement which would have worked. But then when Mr. President Aliyev, the older Aliyev, went back to Baku, he decided this wasn't going to be good. So in the summer of last year, 2020, lots of people were warning that violence could break out again. All the astute observers, from Tom DeWall and various other people, were saying, watch out, this could go very rapidly downhill. And over the summer, there were military maneuvers that Turkey held with Azerbaijan. And this was another signal that should have been caught, because when the war started, Turkey, for the first time, was there with real force, helping Azerbaijan with their own officers, with apparently 6 F-16s, which were maybe not involved in direct combat, but they were there. And then a new drone of Turkish design, which very much tilted the balance of forces in the area, and led to a degradation of the Armenian air defense forces, which were intended to fight a kind of a World War I style trench warfare and some aircraft. But when you suddenly, you're in a trench and you're suddenly being attacked from overhead, all bets are off. So anyway, that's basically what happened. It went almost unnoticed in the Western world, although I have to say that Secretary Pompeo did make a, shall we say, an old school attempt at trying to organize a ceasefire. It did not hold for more than about 5 minutes. And finally, on the afternoon of November 9th, President Putin got the prime minister of Armenia and the president of Azerbaijan to agree to stop the fighting. And there were several other things that came with that agreement. And by the early morning of November 10th, Russian peacekeepers were on their way to Nagorno-Karabakh, in about 2,000 of them, and they're still there. So let me stop here. That's a kind of a quick rundown on what happened, but you may have further questions.
Well, thank you for that. I think you mentioned Turkey, and I think maybe we should talk about their role in the situation. How much blame should we pin on Turkey and Erdogan's geopolitical ambitions for the recent uptick in violence? An article published in the National Interest in October of last year noted that Erdogan is seeking to use a new war in Karabakh to send a message to Moscow. Can you evaluate the Russian response to Turkey's designs in the region, and what was there a likelihood that a wider proxy war could have broken out?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to identify this as one of the big issues that this war, although it was by some standards a small war, although very harmful to the two sides. I mean, the number of dead from this war is over 6,000, which for those small countries is rather considerable. But you're absolutely right. The new factor in this situation was definitely Turkey. Now, previously, Turkey had always given diplomatic and verbal support to Azerbaijan in its attempt to solve this Karabakh problem, but never before had it really committed troops, that is, at least officers, and intelligence, and also these drones. And furthermore, it brought in some 2,000 seasoned troops from the Syrian conflict. Some called them jihadis. Now, whether they were really motivated by religion or whether they were just mercenaries, I think it doesn't matter. But they were used in the front lines to go up against the Armenians,
Right.
which of course saved Azeri soldiers' lives. But you're right to see this as a function to some extent of President Erdogan's rather neo-Ottoman ambitions for the area. I mean, you know that he's been challenging Greece in the Adriatic, rather the Aegean, and he's been very active in Libya. There are disputes over gas rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, Turkey has been very active in the Syrian conflict and even over in Iraq. So this feint to the east is something new for our times, but just 100 years ago. If we look back, the Ottoman Empire, as it was in its last days, made a lunge into the Caucasus and was stopped only by the Armenians at that time. And of course, this was Enver Pasha and his army after they had allied with Germany in World War I. The Turks were turned back by a Russian and Armenian force. at which point the Turks swiveled around and basically committed a genocide on the Armenian population of Turkey itself. And their aspirations, which were based on a kind of an ideology of pan-Turkism, or pan-Turanism, as it's sometimes called, envisioned trying to open a kind of a Turkish corridor through Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijanis are Turkic, although they're Shia, not Sunni, but a corridor that would connect the Turks with their ancient homeland, which is believed to be out in the mountains of Central Asia, close to the border of China. And by the way, that brings to mind the Uyghurs, who are also related to the Turks and are now stranded in Western China with, as we all know, some very unhappy results there. So this is a new phenomenon in our time, since we've been living with the post World War I and World War II division of the world, mainly by the great powers of Europe. But we're into a new game now, with Turkey feeling its oats very much, aspiring to a leadership role within the Muslim world, and to some extent also flirting with Moscow in a kind of an anti-Western, I wouldn't call it alliance, but a dalliance. The Turks, as you know, have bought the Russian S-400 air defense system, very much to the displeasure of the Pentagon.
It would seem that, given all of this, and I've read reports that the Turks sent in jihadists from Syria and Libya who were members of the Syrian Nusra Front during the recent, fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, and they obviously had a hand in supporting ISIS and materially benefiting from selling oil to ISIS. I wonder at what point is NATO going to do something about this kind of wayward member? What's the rationale, in other words, for keeping Turkey inside the NATO alliance?
Well, first of all, there's no provision within the NATO, the Washington Treaty, the NATO Charter, for throwing anybody out of NATO. It's never that's never arisen. We don't know exactly what the content of recent talks have been, either at NATO headquarters or in bilateral meetings with the Turks. We can only imagine. But I also should not forget to mention that the Turks and the Azeris launched this war in the South Caucasus at a time when President Trump was in charge in the United States, and it was well known, and in fact, the Trumps made no secret of the fact that they have business interests in Turkey, and have had business dealings with Azerbaijanis. So part of the calculation here may well have been that we ought to do this right now before there's a change that in the administration that brings Mr. Biden to power.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and thanks for the overview of what is a very complicated problem over in the Caucasus. I think that maybe we'll use our remaining time to turn to Russia. As I alluded to at the top, when you served as Consul General in St. Petersburg in the mid-90s, you dealt with none other than, what would you say, a mid-level bureaucrat by the name of Vladimir Putin. He was mayor, I think, in your article that I mentioned earlier called the Key to Understanding Vladimir Putin, you paint a very different picture of Putin from the one portrayed by US media outlets these days. That of a sinister anti-Western strongman who desires nothing more than to undermine democracy in the West. In your article, you say that Putin is no demon and we may have misunderstood him. That does not make him an angel. But imputing evil to Russia or to any country on the basis of its leader's imagined personality is a dangerous game. So who's the Vladimir Putin you knew, and can we or should we work with him?
Well, you're right that I met Vladimir Putin when he was the first deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, and his boss, Mayor Sobchak, was one of the true Russian Democrats at the time. And Sobchak and Putin, for example, stood up against the attempted putsch against Gorbachev that was launched by the hardliners in the summer of '91, you may remember. I had good dealings with Putin. I was the consul general there for the Americans, and we had some situations, and I would call him. He was very helpful, always did what he said he would do, and did not any signs of anti-Americanism. It's true that he was fluent in German, so he tended to be very friendly with my German consul general colleague. And I think that he, after all, he was appointed by Yeltsin, and I think he wanted nothing more than to have a good relationship with the United States and with Europe. And there are many things that Putin did. I won't list them all now, but there were a number of things that he did in his first term that were remarkably friendly to the United States as we pursued our campaign in Afghanistan, for example, and even in Iraq. But people do change over time. I think that we Americans have an unfortunate tendency to glom onto the personality of some foreign leaders, and we either demonize them, as I think we've done with Putin, or we sanctify them, as we've done, I think, in the case of Navalny, who's now sitting in prison. I mean, I have great respect for Navalny's investigative efforts and also for his courage, but I don't think we ought to be sanctifying him and demonizing Putin. This is their politics. We are not the best judges of it. They will figure it all out. And for that matter, if we sanctify Mr. Navalny, it just makes his situation worse because he can be called an agent of foreign powers. And we all know how that works, and it's not good for those people. So we've got to be, I admire what Jack Matlock said in your recent collection of comments about the way ahead in Russian-American relations. And Jack said that there's a way to not to insult the leaders of other countries, even as we criticize their systems. And I agree with that entirely. We don't need to make this personal. The leaders of other countries have many things to think about, and they also have robust teams of advisors, and the decisions they make are presumably decisions made in the interests of their own countries.
Well, John, I think that is a perfect note to end on. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and discuss these complicated and contentious issues. So thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. All best to you.
Thank you.